Welcome to TriloTalk. This is a podcast dedicated to topics that we think are important to the profession of medical writing. And our goal is to bring these topical issues and ideas to the forefront and spark conversations in the medical writing community.
Hello, everybody. I'm Lisa Chamberlain James. I'm a senior partner at Trilogy, and I'm joined today by Ros Cheetham. Ros is head of clinical operations at a biotechnology company. And I'm really excited because today I get to talk about informed consent forms with a master. She's an expert. So we're going to talk about everything to do with ICFs, why they're important, how you lay them out, where it's going, how plain language fits in, and some crafting tips along the way. As always, please remember that Ros is speaking for herself and not speaking on behalf of her company. So Ros, delighted to see you again. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here.
I could talk to you for hours about this kind of stuff, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But let's start for our listeners by just starting with thinking about what is the informed consent form? Why is it so important? Why are we talking about this today?
Yeah, it's a good place to start. The informed consent form really is the document that lays out for a potential participant in a clinical trial exactly what they're signing up for. It will tell them about the drug or interventions that are being used in the trial. It will explain the structure of the trial. It will give them information about what they can expect during the trial, how many visits there are, how long those visits are, what sort of procedures are going to be done during those visits. And it will also tell them what we know about any drugs that are being used in the trial, what sort of side effects they can expect, and if other trials have been conducted, what results have been seen in those trials. It's really an expanded version of the document which we all sign if we agree to a procedure at a doctor's office.
Right, so it's way more than just a tick box exercise. This really is everything that's going to happen to you if you're part of this trial and what we know about it then. So these are pretty crucial documents.
That's true, it's crucial, but it should also be part of a conversation with the investigator and the investigational staff, because a really important point is that there must be time for that potential participant to ask questions, probably take the consent form home, have an opportunity to read it at their leisure, talk with loved ones about it. The only exception would be if it was a trial in an aspect of critical care, then you may not have that time. But most of the time, you do get the opportunity to take it home and think about it. It becomes a reference document because you get a copy of it.
Yeah, I guess it could be quite useful as well for participants because, I mean, we all have been in a situation, especially if it's something that's happening to you or a loved one, and a doctor or a healthcare professional could be explaining things to you, and however well they explain it, by the time you've left the room, there's so much going on, let alone, the adrenaline and cortisol and everything else that's going on in your body, and you've forgotten what they've told you actually. So I guess I love the way you say it's a reference document, because I guess that the idea is that participants do go back to it and check things if they want to check something up about what's going on or a side effect they might be having, as opposed to just, this is a checklist of you're doing this, then this, then this, then this.
That's right. And we'll talk a bit later about some improvements one can possibly make to make consent forms more user-friendly. And one of the things that we have now done is put a table of contents. And this has been really well received by potential participants because they say, if we do want to refer back to it, we can just see, at section 4 on page 7, and they know exactly where to go.
That's a great idea, because I guess these documents can be pretty lengthy. And actually, the actual informed consent part of it is just the legal page at the end where the signature goes. But the whole rest of it, the header part of it, the patient information sheet, really, isn't it? But that could be really quite lengthy. If you've got a complex trial, I guess it could go on for pages, right?
Well, generally speaking, these days, they're around 20 plus pages.
Wow, that's a lot.
Because there's a lot of information that we are required by the FDA in the US, by the European Union, by other regulatory agencies, and by good clinical practice to include in the consent form. So it's really important to make it more attractive than just 20 pages of black and white, single-spaced type,
Absolutely.
which anybody would struggle to read through.
Yeah. And do you think that the ICF really makes a difference to how patients engage with clinical trials and with adherence and compliance?
I do, but I think it makes a difference even as to whether somebody agrees to participate.
Right.
Because I think that if they're made to feel welcomed during that process, if they receive a document that they can understand and can read easily, it immediately becomes a more welcoming environment than if they're struggling to understand the consent form. And then maybe people think, well, if it's all so complex and it's all in medical jargon, is something being hidden? I don't understand all of it. Whereas if you write it in plain language, in easy to read chunks broken down into sections, perhaps with call out boxes explaining some of the terminology, I think it makes people feel much more welcome. And the focus groups that we did, when we showed people an old style consent form that really was just pages of type, and then we showed them a revised version that included color, much more breakdown into sections, the use of tables and call out boxes. All the participants in those focus groups said, now we really understand it. Now we would be prepared to participate. Whereas when we showed them the old one, there were a lot of questions and a lot of concerns.
Wow, that's huge. That's such a finding. It's so important. And I guess, trust is so important, especially when you're dealing with any medical aspect. Trust is of vital importance. And I know you've got a huge amount of experience in this area. You mentioned the old format ICFs. So you must have seen how plain language has evolved over the years. I mean, certainly just in the time that I've been a medical writer, I started off and nobody was talking about plain language or lay language. It was just kind of almost like a kind of something that was on the side that some people did, but most people weren't really paying attention to. And now the regulators are really pushing and advocating for patients to have better information. Have you seen that evolve in your experience?
Yes, I mean, it's evolving in a number of ways. The first is that we now have to provide what are called plain language summaries of our protocols. The protocol sets out exactly how the trial is going to be conducted. And so those are made available on the internet so that people can see them and read them and understand them. And I think I started out in the industry more years ago than I'd care to say. But back in those days, the informed consent documents were a little shorter and a little simpler because perhaps we didn't fully understand everything that should be included. And as the desire for greater transparency and greater involvement of patients in the decision-making process around all their medical treatment has evolved, we've wanted to give more and more information about the trials.
Yeah.
But with that, I think, came a level of complexity. And it's very easy for those of us that work in this field every day to slip into using medical jargon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I even saw it the other day when we were amending an informed consent document, and someone had included a new side effect, which was that one might develop a flu-like syndrome. And I picked that up and I said, nobody outside of the medical profession talks about a flu-like syndrome.
Yeah.
Talking about a flu-like illness and giving examples of the sort of symptoms, fever, a high temperature,
Yeah.
malaise, and so on, that people might feel. So even when this is top of mind, it's very easy to slip into that medical jargon. And so I think that what happened was, in our desire to give more and more information to potential clinical trial participants and make sure that they were fully informed, I think we slipped into some medical jargon. So now I'm really pleased that, we're paying much more attention to this and making sure that it's in everyday language.
Yeah.
That really, anybody who is not involved in medical things, someone who perhaps, just finished high school or maybe didn't even finish high school, would still be able to understand is really important.
Oh, I totally agree. But it's such a hard balancing act, isn't it? Because medical jargon exists for a reason. It's kind of a shorthand. It's a way for us to express complex concepts in just a couple of words, sometimes even just one word. I mean, syndrome's a really good example that you could write a paragraph on what a syndrome actually is in plain language. But we all have shorter and shorter attention spans. I mean, the love of TikTok is testament to that alone. Let alone the fact that we have children coming through school now who don't have the attention span to read a whole book anymore, and it's a real problem globally. So how do we balance that? The need for giving enough information in plain language, which takes more space, more words than jargon, with actually keeping people engaged and being able to get those messages across. Because if they get bored, if there are too many words, if it's too long, actually it doesn't matter how well you've written it, because they're just not going to read it anyway. So how do you approach creating that balance, working that balance out?
Well, there's two very interesting things here that we discovered when we did our work to simplify the informed consent document. And as I say, we did focus groups with people who either had cancer or had a relative with cancer. And we were quite worried because after we did our plain language version, instead of it being 20 pages, it was now actually 23 or 24 pages. And so we asked our focus group about this, and they said, oh, we didn't mind the length because it was so engaging and so easy to read. So I think that the more important thing to think about and focus on is breaking the document down into manageable chunks, almost chapters, if you like.
Yeah.
And within that, having a little bit of color or different types of typefaces, not having just solid text, but having some text and then perhaps a table explaining how many visits there are in the trial, what the examinations and the procedures are going to be, and, an estimate of how much time each visit might take. And we also put some call-out boxes in. So, explaining what is a clinical trial.
Yes. Yeah.
So, and what they said was that because we had the table of contents, they could read a couple of sections or chapters, and they could stop. They could go make a cup of coffee, or they
Without
could go
losing their
do
way.
something.
Yeah.
And then they could come back and they knew where to pick up again and keep reading. And so I think if you make the consent document easier for people to pick up and put down, so sure, the investigator, the doctor will have gone through it all. But when they get home, if they can read a couple of sections and go do something, read a couple of sections and come back.
Yeah.
I think this all contributed to them saying, we didn't mind the length.
Yes, I love that. And I think I think you said something earlier on about it being more friendly and engaging, and it's less scary. I mean, going into a clinical trial it can be a really scary experience, especially if it's your first one. Especially you're not in the medical field at all yourself. This is something way outside of any of your sphere of reference. It can be a really scary experience, and to be handed just pages and pages of very dry text can only increase your anxiety, I would imagine. I mean, I quite like.
I mean, I have not done this myself, but I have also seen groups have short videos made about the clinical trial that don't substitute for the consent form and the consent document, but they augment it so that it's really a sort of quick visual about the trial and a quick visual about what's going to happen. It maybe lasts 5 minutes. And so again, I think that's another way we can think about demystifying a clinical trial. For pediatric trials, I have also seen people do something that's more like a cartoon book, to go through with the kids, because even if they're young, you should be getting assent.
I was just going to say that I've seen
child's
videos.
Agreement to doing this, even though the parent or guardian is going to give the consent.
Yeah.
But it's really important to engage the groups appropriately. If you're dealing with a really elderly demographic, then probably a written document might be the best. But some trials these days use electronic consent forms. And for some diseases and for some patient demographics, that's also a good tool. I think it's no longer one size fits all.
Yeah.
I think we really have to think about, excuse me, I think we have to think about who is the customer here, the actual potential clinical trial participant, and do something that is going to make their lives easier.
Absolutely agree. And I was going to say that I'd seen videos used for assent forms really successfully. They are very expensive to produce. They're not easy to produce, but it really works very, very well for some demographics. And even in some demographics, so some patient groups have cognitive decline, for example, they can be really, really useful.
Yeah. And it can be a combination. It could be you have your consent document, consent form, but perhaps you have a short video that explains the mechanism of action of the drug.
Yes, exactly. That's a great idea.
And novel. I think it's just making this process more accessible and using the type of media that's appropriate and that perhaps people are accustomed to seeing.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's great that we can actually start thinking about that these days we've got a lot more tools in our toolbox to be able to reach our target audience, you know, the clinical trial participant. That's who we're trying to reach. I love the use of the word customer. They are actually our customers. That's who we're trying to write this for. So yeah, I think it's a great time to be a medical writer and writing in plain language, because there's a lot that we can a lot of threads we can start to pull on. We can really use our creativity. I know we've spoken a lot about how you've seen things evolve over time and where we're going, but that is also the same for the regulations. And I said at the very early on that I'm really heartened because now regulators are really advocating for patients way more than they ever were able to publicly, and are really making industry provide better information for patients. So I'm asking you to get your crystal ball out now, Ros. Drawing on your vast experience of where we've been to where we are now, where do you see us going in the future in terms of ICFs? Can you see more legislation coming? Do you think we've gone as far as we can? Where do you think we're going with it?
I think the legislation will continue to be tweaked.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what we're probably going to be asked for more and more, and we're already asked for this, for example, if we run a clinical trial in the UK, is to provide evidence that we've actually consulted with patients about the consent form and consent document. So an IRB, an ethics committee, as they're called in the UK, asks for evidence that we have already done that. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if that's not a requirement that will become more widespread into the future. So then, you know, we're not only going to have to say, well, this document has a reading age of grade 6, but we're going to have to say, yes, we've put it in front of a panel of people who have the same disease that we're targeting in this trial, and they have reviewed it, they had these comments, we made this and this change based on that feedback. So I think it's going to become more and more important that pharmaceutical sponsor companies actually gain that sort of input into the process. So I think the voice of the patient is going to become more prevalent in clinical trials.
That's such a heartening thought, and I think that can only help clinical development, honestly. And also, it's not fair to ask a patient, the whole no decision about me without me is so important. You can't ask a patient to be more involved in their care and more involved in their treatment without empowering them with the knowledge and the examples and the background contextualization for them to be able to make that decision. You can't make a decision if you don't know anything about the ramifications of either choice. So I think it's really, really important. And I really hope that you're right, Ros. I really hope that is the way that legislation is going. I know it's recommended in all the guidances and the regulations now that patients are heavily involved, but there's no real teeth behind it yet. So I would really like to see those teeth put into place and to bring patients to the forefront even more. But I think we're definitely going in the right direction for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that is, I know we're at time. That is a lovely place to stop. We will stop on a positive, optimistic note that patients will be involved way more on a regulatorily mandated basis. And thank you so much for sharing your extensive knowledge and wisdom with us today. As always, time has just sped by. I could talk to you about this for hours. So thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you so much for all of you who've listened. Please catch us on podcasts, wherever you normally pick up your podcasts. And thank you so much, Ros. I'm sure we will be speaking again very soon.
Thank you, Lisa. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to TriloTalk today. If you have feedback you'd like to share, or if you have any ideas for future topics you'd like us to cover, particularly something you think the community should be talking about, we would love to hear it. We would like this to be an ongoing conversation with medical writers at large, and you can send us your comments on our Twitter feed or our LinkedIn page. Just a reminder, you can find all our episodes of TriloTalk podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Podcasts, Spotify, and trilogywriting.com/TriloTalk. Have a great rest of your day.